Greetings. I wanted to bring another quick video forth sharing some of my amateur musings on language, and I put emphasis on amateur. Some may recall that last month I had a short video on the name Morteza and the Farsi letter Zwad, in which I shared some basic thoughts on that character in light of the Hebrew tzadeh. Fast forward to this week, I was working on something unrelated, and it dawned on me that I had been somewhat remiss in that video from last month, insofar that I didn't think to make recourse to Ethiopian languages for further insight. So I wanted to offer this video as a sort of quick addendum to that. To explain how I reached this point, yesterday I was contemplating Mark 7:26 in the Peshitta, which is the ancient Syrian Aramaic translation of the Bible, along with Surat al-Imran 367, the 67th verse of the third chapter of the Quran. What interested me was that the two texts seemed to use similar terminology, with the woman who asked Christ to heal her daughter being referred to as Hanefta, and Abraham being referred to as a Hanif. I made a YouTube community post which compared the two terms, transcribing their consonantal structures into other scripts so as to make the similarities more apparent. And I argued that if we understand the relevant Syriac term in a non-pejorative sense, along the lines of female non-Jew, it might serve as a potential parallel for the way the relevant Arabic term is being used in reference to Abraham. At that point, I decided to check the Ge'ez translation of Mark 7:26 to see if it might employ a similar term, perhaps a term from the same root. What I found there was a word which was not etymologically related. It was, completely different root. Moreover, it was a term I was unfamiliar with. I'm not even entirely sure how it's pronounced, though my guess is it's along the lines of amtsere. Whatever the case, and I hope others will forgive me or correct me on that. More importantly, I was initially frustrated by the fact that I could not find either that term or its presumed root, which would be those last three characters, in the Ge'ez dictionaries I had access to. However, eventually I figured out that the term could be found by altering the spelling of the root, not only transposing the ayin at the end with an alif, but more relevant to this video, transposing the tsapa with a sadi. It turns out that the relevant term means Greek. So the Ge'ez translation was saying that she was a Greek woman. Now here I'd like to focus on that third character in each of the two alternative spellings at the top of your screen. On the left is the tsapa, and on the right is the sadi. Now the character on the left corresponds to the Arabic dad, while the character on the right corresponds to the Arabic sad. At the bottom of the screen, I compare each character to the Arabic equivalent character in both the South Arabian and the now standard Arabic form. And I do that to sort of make the connection more clear because, sometimes just comparing Ge'ez characters to characters in the standard Arabic script, their connection isn't clear. When you use the South Arabian script as a sort of bridge or medium, the connections become a lot more clear. Now, while the two Arabic characters are pronounced quite differently, the two Ge'ez characters have pronunciations which are scarcely distinguishable, at least in Ethiopian languages today. Hence why they can stand in for each other in the spellings of words which employ them, why you can put one in place of the other. And here's an example of how the characters are pronounced with their different vocalizations. In fact, from what I've seen, some even treat them basically as different characters representing the same single phoneme.
Fidel, አለ። እስቲ ቃላቶችን ከማየታችን በፊት ድምጾችን እንማር።
What interests me and what I'd like to focus on in this video is the fact that the Ge'ez Tsa and the Persian Zad both descend from the Arabic Dad. Yet the Ge'ez Tsa and the Persian Zad sound more like each other than they do like the Arabic Dad. Now, as a disclaimer, I'm not claiming the Ge'ez and Farsi characters are pronounced exactly the same. You know, I can hear the difference between Tsa and Za, but I do think they're more close to each other than either of them are to the Arabic character from which they descend. You know, think about it. Tsa, Za, Da. You know, Tsa and Za sound more like each other than either of them do like Da. And that raises some interesting questions. You know, first and foremost, are these alleged mispronunciations of the Dad a mere coincidence? You know, and if so, how might something like that happen? In an attempt to illustrate what I have in mind, try to imagine the region where these languages sprang forth from, you know? Let's think of the Jazira, the Arabian Peninsula, as the starting point for Arabic. Now, obviously, I understand that Arabic has spread well beyond that by this point, fairly quickly it did, but you know, for now, let's just think of the Arabian Peninsula as the locus point for Arabic. Then think of the Persian-speaking lands as roughly northeast of the Arabian Peninsula, right? So this could be not, of course, Iran, but also parts of Pakistan, Afghanistan, and then other countries as well. But, you know, basically to the northeast of the Arabian Peninsula. And then think of the lands where Ethiopian Semitic languages are spoken as roughly being to the southwest of the Arabian Peninsula. In short, the Persian and Ethiopian languages are basically on opposite ends of the locus point for Arabic. And this fact leaves one to wonder, how did the Dad become Zad when going northeast and Tsa when going southwest? How could peoples on opposite ends of the peninsula make roughly the same quote-unquote mistake, assuming for the sake of argument that these pronunciations constitute simple mistakes? Now, I've encountered people who sort of flippantly wave their hand and say that the Farsi Zad is simply the result of, you know, Persians being unable to pronounce the Dad. And, you know, the tone of people who say that often hints that they think Persians are somehow just silly like that. I haven't discussed the Ge'ez Tsa with people like that, as its connection to Arabic is a bit more obscure, but I do feel confident that if it was explained that the Tsa comes from the South Arabian Dad, some would likewise just chalk it up to Ethiopians not being able to pronounce that relevant Arabic character. And, you know, it's easy to imagine one of these languages, you know, one or the other group making this sort of quote-unquote mistake. But I wish to ask again, how did both groups at opposite ends of the spectrum, how did two different groups at opposite ends of the geographical spectrum make roughly the same mistake, quote-unquote mistake? Now, pondering that question led me to contemplating a perhaps crazy thought. Might Ge'ez and Farsi serve as independent witnesses to an alternative pronunciation of Dad, which may have existed amongst some Arabs? Emphasis on some. Now, as a disclaimer, I'm not insinuating that such a hypothetical alternative must have been the original pronunciation or the correct pronunciation. I'm only sharing that one possible explanation of this phenomenon is that an alternative pronunciation may have existed amongst certain Arabs, a non-standard pronunciation. On a minor note, it's interesting that on page 121 of Edward Lipinski's book on Semitic languages, titled Semitic Languages, treats the Ge'ez Tsapa as originally being pronounced Dapa, like the Arabic Dad. He seems to entertain the thought, however, that the South Arabian form might have had an emphatic S, tss, or perhaps even a sort of like an emphatic TH, you know, th use, something along those lines. And so that's interesting. But more interesting is this Twitter thread from January of 2019, in which Marijn van Putten explores the pronunciation of Dad in light of what was written on the subject by some old Arabic writers, from the early medieval period. it reveals that the pronunciation of this character in Arabic is not a simple subject. I'll put a link to the thread in the video description for anyone who wants to take a careful look at it. It's worth perusing. Personally, I found it particularly interesting that Van Putte notes that one medieval writer spoke out against those who pronounced the character along the lines of a Z phoneme, a sort of emphatic Z. And Van Putte notes that some modern Bedouin dialects still do this to this day. Van Putte also recommended this interesting article published in the journal Arabica, the 57th volume of such from back in 2010 by Munira al-Azraqi, titled The Ancient Dad in Southwest Saudi Arabia. This piece notes other medieval Arabic writers who recorded that some Arabs pronounced the character along the lines of a sort of emphatic Z phoneme. Now, I share that simply to make this point. The Persian and Ethiopian pronunciations might not be mere clumsy mispronunciations. Rather, they might simply descend from less popular, non-standard pronunciations of the character that existed amongst some Arabs. That's an important point, I think. So that crazy thought that I had shared a little while ago doesn't necessarily seem so crazy after all. It seems there is some evidence of these alternative pronunciations existing in certain circles. And with that in mind, if I can segue a bit, I came across this video which translates portions of speeches by Yasser Qadi and Numan Ali Khan into Amharic. And I wanted to zoom in on how Yasser Qadi's name is spelled in the Ge'ez script in the title. The last character in his name is Ge'ez's equivalent of the Arabic dal, which corresponds to the Hebrew dalet, for anyone who's wondering. Now, I understand this makes sense as his name is popularly pronounced in English, Qadi, right? And so to Arabic. And he himself pronounces that way, at least, in these settings, these public settings, English-speaking settings, and I'm guessing Arabic-speaking settings as well. So the closest equivalent to that pronunciation would, in the Ge'ez script, would employ this character, the equivalent of Arabic's dal. However, as Qadi is spelled with a dad, one could have alternatively rendered his name in the Ge'ez script with the tsi, right? Qatsi. Now, I realize one might object at this point, but then the pronunciation would be off, right? It's Qadi, not Qatsi, right? However, I would counter that Qadi's parents are from Pakistan, and therefore there are almost certainly members of his family who pronounce it Qazi. Perhaps even Yasser Qadi himself pronounces his name Qazi when he's in, Urdu language settings. When he's speaking Urdu with other Urdu speakers, he himself might be saying Qazi.
Qazi Sahab.
Oh, and by the way, regarding that Twitter thread by Marijn van Putte, he shared a video which he feels captures the original pronunciation of the character now called Dad. So I figured it might be worthwhile to play a bit of that video now.
Zo. 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 Allah. Oz.
Let me confess up front that I unfortunately don't have, quite the ear for that particular phoneme. In my crude hearing, I may be mishearing it, but I heard something akin to a Z phoneme mixed with a th phoneme, like a TH phoneme, almost like a Z with a lisp. And forgive me if that's a crude way of describing it. And again, perhaps I'm mistaken. Perhaps I just don't have the ear for it. Different people from different language backgrounds just have different ears for different phonemes. Nonetheless, I share all this only to argue that the relevant Ethiopian and Persian pronunciations, again, are less absurd if we think of them as reflecting the pronunciations of non-standard Arabic dialects. Now, that's not to say there couldn't have been some change. The Dad could have been pronounced in one region and then it's made its way into Farsi or Ge'ez. The pronunciation may have changed slightly more, but whatever the case, the point is that it's not obvious that these are simply erroneous mispronunciations, because it seems that there were multiple pronunciations within the history of the Arabic language. Oh, and on a side note, it's interesting that, if that phoneme that appeared in that video shared by Van Putte, if that phoneme did have a sort of th sound, right? As the Ge'ez and South Arabian characters resemble the Greek theta, that makes that possibility interesting, that here you have a character representing, especially in the South Arabian script, resembling the Greek theta and having possibly a sort of th pronunciation. Now, I understand that the Greek theta has a softer sound, like in the English word Thursday. It's not that sort of harder, perhaps more emphatic sound that one might find in the English words the or this, right? But the graphical and phonological similarities, potential graphical and phonological similarities, nonetheless strike me as interesting and perhaps worth contemplation. But maybe that's for minds brighter than my own. That aside, I also put the Gaulish languages, Tau Gallicum, on the screen on the right there, because that was apparently also based on the Greek theta, yet that character in the Gaulish language represented a tsa phoneme, not unlike the Ge'ez character. Now, while I have no idea why the theta was the inspiration for representing a tsa phoneme, it seems interesting in light of this discussion, But again, perhaps that's yet another topic to be explored in another video in another time. One last area that might be worth contemplating is how the Greek theta descends from the Phoenician tet, which corresponds to the Hebrew tet and the Arabic ta, as well as the Arabic tha, which is the ta with which is the Arabic ta with a dot above it, which some pronounce za. I've encountered people who pronounce it that way. But again, that's another topic for another discussion for people brighter than me. As you can see, how different characters are employed as they evolve across different languages can be a complex subject. And, these sort of amateur musings are just scratching the surface of that, But, as I said, these are just my amateur musings on the subject. I hope others found them interesting. And, as always, I look forward to the comments of others. God bless.